I knew something was off when the florist called to confirm a delivery of 76 white lilies to the executive suite, my office included. White lilies. Funerals. They weren't even subtle about it. The ink on the $5.2 billion merger contract hadn't dried. And already I was being buried alive in a polite corporate coffin lined with vague compliments and recycled HR statements. We're going in a new direction. Yeah. One where they don't have to look me in the eye after gutting the only department that understood what the hell we just signed. I'd spent 11 years in that company. Not on the front lines, not in press releases, not even mentioned on LinkedIn except as senior staff. But I was the one who read every clause, caught every liability landmine, and cleaned up every deal Travis Calloway's daddy's friends tried to jam through with cigar smoke and smiley face emojis. And when this merger came down from Olympus, 5 firms, 4 jurisdictions, 3 time zones, and 1,000 potential lawsuits tangled into one beautiful monstrosity, I didn't flinch. They gave me the pen. I built the walls. And I built a few trapdoors. Real quick before we go any deeper, if you're even remotely invested in stories like this, hit the like button and subscribe. 97% of people who hear these stories never subscribe, and it genuinely helps the team keep the fire going. Don't be that 97%. Anyway, back to the death flowers. I wasn't surprised. When the new CEO, Travis Calloway, was announced, I could smell the cologne through the screen. Stanford MBA. Yacht tanned. Hair so perfect it probably had its own trust fund. They put him on the cover of Next Gen Leader, before he even had the parking pass. And me? I was still in the same corner office with a busted HVAC and a coffee machine that brewed regret. But I knew the stakes. I knew what I was building. You see, the problem wasn't Travis. It was what came with him. His family had their tentacles in 3 of the 5 companies in the merger. Quiet holdings, shell stakes, shadow firms tucked behind Delaware filings and European trusts. Everyone knew it. No one said it out loud. But I built for it. Quietly. Thoroughly. The same way you lay rat poison in a penthouse. Not because you've seen the rats, but because you know they're coming. Page 2734. Section Delta. A clause so deeply buried it would take 2 interns, a Red Bull drip, and a flashlight to find it. I called it Contingency Delta on purpose. Generic enough to skip the radar. Dangerous enough to burn a dynasty. The gist? If any undisclosed family-tied entity moved assets post-merger, without triggering the proper disclosures, the liability protections would evaporate. Not with a bang. With a quiet, legal whimper. Auto default. No court hearing. Just gone. Legal didn't catch it. They skimmed. They always do. Hell, even I almost forgot about it until the lilies showed up and I remembered. Oh right. I left the trapdoor open. Just in case. I wasn't the hero of this place. I was the custodian. The janitor of corporate consequences. And now the golden boy with his bulletproof teeth and Instagram abs was walking into a glass palace I built on foundations made of fuse wire. All he had to do was step wrong. And baby, he was already mid-stride. Travis Calloway strutted into the boardroom like he was auditioning for a biopic that hadn't been greenlit yet. Tan grinning, with that smug glint in his eye that said, I don't have to understand this room. I already own it. He didn't. Not yet. But damn if he didn't act like it. The kind of guy who thought nuance was a sauce. The kind who took one look at an 11-year vet like me and saw deadwood. Never mind that I built the entire damn forest he was standing in. His first meeting as CEO was a branding blitz. New logos, new taglines, corporate values rewritten by consultants who thought integrity was a font choice. And then he did what all insecure leaders do when trying to prove they belong. He started pruning. Not based on performance. Based on optics. Older directors with deep context? Gone. Long-serving ops leads who'd seen 3 economic cycles and knew how to survive every one? Reassigned or invited to explore new opportunities. It was a cleansing. A purge dressed in modern lingo. Realignment. Synergistic evolution. Value clarity. When he turned his attention to legal, I knew my number was coming up. We were mid-review. While I was reviewing, he was flicking through a golf app on his iPad. When he leaned back in that $3,200 ergonomic throne and said, This contract, no offense, reads like a pre-internet novella. Are we not doing agile law now? I didn't answer. Just let the silence stretch long enough to make his assistant shift uncomfortably. Travis smirked like he thought he'd scored. Don't worry, we're streamlining. Legal's getting leaner. Faster. Less library. His eyes didn't even flick to me as he said it. Just a casual bullet, fired sideways. He had no idea I wrote the framework that kept this entire merger from collapsing into an SEC investigation. He had no idea that the very deal giving him this podium was stitched together clause by someone he just likened to a museum exhibit. What bothered me wasn't the insult. I've been overlooked for most of my career. You don't last this long in corporate America as a woman without learning to absorb disrespect like drywall takes thumbtacks. What bothered me was the way he spoke about the contract. Like it was ornamental. As if I'd spent 6 months writing fan fiction for the fine print gods. As if I didn't spend nights diagramming interlocking liabilities like a crime scene, anticipating every legal loophole someone like him might try to slide through in a champagne fog of entitlement. The head of finance looked at me across the table. Briefly. A flicker of sympathy, maybe warning. Didn't matter. I wasn't panicking. I was watching. Because people like Travis don't just self-destruct. They host viewing parties for it. He closed the meeting with a rousing speech about fresh eyes and bold futures. I stayed behind, collecting my materials like a ghost clearing her desk before the death notice. As I left, I heard him laugh, loud, unearned, the kind of laugh that makes everyone else fake one just to stay employed. The thing is, he thought the contract was done, that the deal was locked, that all the power now belonged to him. What he didn't know was this. I wrote that contract like a loaded weapon. And right now it was still holstered. But not for long. They scheduled the all-hands in the atrium. Glass walls, complimentary croissants, those ridiculous branded beanbags no one ever sits on. Travis had a thing for optics. And this was his victory lap. The new CEO. The golden boy who shepherded us into the future. Never mind, he arrived after the contract was inked. There were cameras. Corporate photographers. Someone actually handed out little next chapter pins like we were pledging a damn fraternity. I sat near the back. No name card. Just a lukewarm coffee and the awareness that I was about to be eulogized by a man who couldn't spell indemnification if you spotted him the first 9 letters. He took the stage with that signature. I'm not rehearsed. I'm just naturally this inspirational stance. Sleeves rolled, jaw tight, voice artificially gravelly. We've got incredible momentum, he beamed. We've crossed into a new era. And with every evolution, comes transition. That's when he said my name. Not with reverence. Not even with full syllables. Just enough to register. She's been a foundational part of our journey. Truly. But we're pivoting toward a leaner, more tech-driven legal strategy. So today, we thank her for her service to the old era. And wish her all the best. There it was. Like ripping a band-aid off a ghost. Polite applause scattered across the room like gunfire with bad aim. A few claps here, awkward hesitation there. No one cheered. Some people blinked like they couldn't process what they'd just heard. A few lower-level staff looked openly horrified. But no one stood. No one interrupted. That's corporate death. Quiet, clean PR ready. I stood. Smoothed my blazer. Walked the slow path to the stage. Past new hires who didn't even know who I was. Past executives who owed me more than they'd ever admit. Travis extended a hand like he expected gratitude. I shook it. Smiled. Didn't say a word. Not to him. But as I passed his assistant, Emily, 26, fast-tracked via nepotism and a bullet-point resume filled with fluff, I leaned in just close enough for her to feel the heat of my breath and said, "Remind legal to review Section Delta in case of any family overlaps." Her brow creased. But I didn't wait for comprehension. I just kept walking. No rage. No scene. Just silence. The kind that makes people nervous. The kind that follows the first click before a detonation. Behind me, Travis went back to grinning. Called up the new head of legal. A former consultant who still had the price tag on his briefcase. Everyone smiled. Took their notes. Acted like nothing cracked beneath the floorboards. But I knew what was coming. Section Delta wasn't just a clause. It was the match. and he'd just fired the woman holding it. The first draft of Contingency Delta was written at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday, during one of those half-conscious sprints where the fluorescent office light starts buzzing like a fly trapped in a bottle. I had a legal pad filled with crossed-out terms, a third mug of stale coffee, and exactly one motivation pulsing through every keystroke. If I was going to be the last line of defense, I wasn't going to leave the door half-closed. Most people think contracts are just glorified paperwork, boilerplate, copy-paste clauses, nice clean signatures. They have no idea. Real contracts, the kind that move billions, are war maps. And I'd been fighting corporate landmines long enough to know where the bodies get buried. Trusts, family LLCs, asset protection firms hidden behind multi-tiered shells in Luxembourg and the Caymans. A simple change in leadership could unlock decades of strategic laundering, unless you had the foresight to complicate things. Contingency Delta wasn't flashy. It was built like a fungus. Quiet, buried, designed to grow in the dark. Here's how it worked. The clause sat inside Section 2734, deep in the Asset Indemnification Appendix. It redefined material conflict in a way that didn't just apply to direct holdings, but extended its reach, like ivy through a brick wall, into any undisclosed familial interest tied to a post-merger leadership appointment. Didn't matter if the stake was 0.01% or a hidden beneficiary of a third-tier trust. If the disclosure wasn't filed within 30 days of leadership change, the default mechanism triggered. And not just a slap on the wrist trigger. No, this was a structural booby trap. All asset protection benefits were voided. Trust walls collapsed. Insurance layers peeled back. Internal compliance flags fired off like flares in a blackout. And the genius of it? It required no manual intervention. Once the clause was active, it monitored. Quietly. Through a system of triggers embedded into the post-merger governance protocols. Automatic reporting checks, metadata audits, back-end compliance reconciliations. I designed it to be too boring for PR, too dense for the casual reader, and just technical enough that legal skimmed it with glazed eyes, assuming I'd double-checked it like always. I hadn't just checked it. I tested it. Ran simulations through 3 dummy entities to make sure the cascading fail-safes triggered properly. Tied it to calendar-based disclosures. Mapped it against the family tree of every major stakeholder, including the Callaways, who were notorious for stashing assets in foundations with fake missions like sea turtle preservation, that somehow owned half of a biotech firm. It wasn't revenge. Not then. It was defense. I'd spent years cleaning up messes from men like Travis. Men with trust fund veneers and zero respect for the ink they inherited. I knew one day someone like him would roll in, blind to nuance, allergic to detail, and so sure of his untouchability that he wouldn't bother to read the fine print. So I wrote a clause just for him. And I buried it so deep no one else even noticed. Not legal, who assumed I was too cautious to trip my own wire. Not compliance, who didn't understand the cross-reference triggers tucked into the asset exposure audit. Not the board, who signed off on the doc after scanning only the summary memo. And definitely not Travis Callaway, who laughed off the contract as a relic, unaware that buried inside it was a countdown he'd already started the moment he said my name with that smug little smirk. By the time they'd read it, it would be too late. Contingency Delta didn't need me anymore. It was already breathing. It started with a name on a spreadsheet, Callaway and Renshaw Holdings, line 48, a routine line item transfer between 2 domestic trust arms. The kind of thing that happens 100 times a year. Quiet. Legal. In turn handled. The digital equivalent of white noise. But this time, the timing was wrong. The leadership had changed. The disclosures hadn't been filed. And Contingency Delta didn't give a damn about intentions. The trigger was subtle. A compliance scan cross-referenced entity IDs and found a mismatch in the disclosure index. One of the shell firms tied to the Callaway family had failed to update its beneficiary tree within the 30-day post-appointment window. That's all it took. An algorithm tucked into a forgotten corner of the governance platform flagged it as a Category 7 breach. Automatic. The system ran a second validation. Cross-checked the transaction timestamp. Confirmed the lack of updated documentation. Then quietly, without so much as a ping to legal, It initiated the rollback protocol. Contingency Delta activated. At 9:04 a.m., the asset protection firewall between two of the family's largest holding firms dropped. Not maliciously. Not loudly. Just gone. Like pulling the pin out of a grenade and setting it gently on the boardroom table. By 9:07, custodial controls kicked in. Funds were frozen, not because anyone asked them to be, but because the contract had given them standing authority in the event of undisclosed conflicts. It wasn't a shutdown. It was a legal tourniquet. And it squeezed. I wasn't there to see it. I was already 35,000 feet above Colorado, window seat, second Bloody Mary half-drunk, flipping through a paperback I'd been pretending to read since takeoff. No Wi-Fi. No Slack pings. Just me, silence, and the knowledge that a machine I built was now operating without me. And operating perfectly. I felt it in my chest, like a change in cabin pressure. Not joy. Not revenge. Just the cold satisfaction of inevitability. When you spend over a decade in boardrooms where men like Travis Calloway swing their name like a cudgel and treat the people doing the real work like stage props, you learn patience. You learn how to let someone walk themselves into their own pit without warning them. You learn how to give them the exact amount of rope they insist they don't need, and how to quietly tie it to a legal clause they never bothered to read. The first domino wasn't dramatic. No headlines. No sirens. Just an automated compliance report routed to an inbox no one checked fast enough. A policy triggered. A trust pierced. And $30 million worth of assets suddenly exposed to regulatory review. The next domino was already leaning. I closed my book, looked out the window, and smiled without teeth. At exactly 10:03 a.m., the custodians overseeing two of the Calloway family's investment vehicles hit the switch. Not because of scandal, not because of a leak, but because the algorithm built into the contract said now. They didn't call the CEO. They didn't loop in the board. They didn't need to. The compliance protocols were hard-coded into the post-merger structure. Ironclad, automatic, irreversible without full board consensus, and a legal unwind that would take weeks they didn't have. One custodian flagged the breach as structural exposure via undisclosed leadership entanglement. The other one used plainer language. You didn't tell us Travis's trust owned 19% of the company that just moved $42 million. From the outside, it looked like a brief pause, just two blinking lights on an internal dashboard. But from the inside, it was a hemorrhage. Hundreds of automatic transactions halted, asset pathways frozen, wire transfers flagged mid-flight. One of the accounts even triggered a provisional audit from a Swiss regulatory partner, who did not appreciate being looped in through an automated ping. Legal went into a frenzy. Calls were made. Messages pinged up and down the compliance ladder. But the center of gravity was missing. Travis? He was still at the Pinnacle Club. Hole 6. Practicing his swing on company time with a venture capital bro named Zane who wore sockless loafers and called every woman Mississippi. While the firm bled internally, Travis was on his second bourbon and talking about launching a podcast. By 10:29, I got the text. It was from the CFO, James. We weren't close, but he wasn't an idiot. He'd spent years building risk models based on my red lines. If anyone could smell smoke, it was him. James, did you know anything about Section 2734? I stared at it for a second. Thought about sending the clause. Thought about spelling it out. Then I didn't. Me. Yes. That was it. No elaboration. No smiley. No threat. Just confirmation. The next text didn't come. I knew why. Because by then, James would have pulled the contract. He would have searched 2734 and landed in the middle of the rabbit hole. Subsection D. Provision 2. Clause Delta. He'd read the language and realized the problem wasn't just legal. It was built into the bones of the deal. And then he'd do what every panicked exec does when faced with a slow-rolling detonation. Start flipping backwards. Page 2733. Page 2732. Page 2730. Each paragraph quietly revealing the noose that had been knotted long before Travis ever opened his mouth in that boardroom. I imagined James pacing in his office, tie loosened, legal pad filling with arrows and question marks, A trail of, "How the hell did we miss this?" scribbled in the margins. But they did miss it. Because I made sure they would. I didn't hide the clause. I just made it boring. Technical. Nestled between reporting requirements and hedge mechanics no one cared to read. I layered it behind definitions so dry they made your eyes cross. And no one, not legal, not compliance, not even the board's contract review subcommittee, bothered to challenge the assumption that I had already vetted it. I had. I vetted it against the exact kind of arrogance they'd installed in the corner office. The freeze wasn't the failure. It was the signal. And now the only person who understood what was really happening was 35,000 feet away, sipping sparkling water and watching a storm form on the horizon below. Travis was still swinging his club, but the ball was already in the water. By 8:42 p.m., the boardroom lights were still on. Not the usual soft, amber mood lighting they used for evening presentations, but full fluorescence, harsh, buzzing, like an interrogation room. Half the board was physically present, the other half blinking in on grainy video feeds from their vacation homes and yachts and overpriced Manhattan dens. No catering. No plaisanteries. Just folders. Screens. Numbers no one wanted to say out loud. Travis walked in late, still in golf shoes. Rumor is he didn't even know why he was summoned until the head of compliance threw a 54-page incident report on the table and said, Section 2734. Read it. He didn't. He stared at it like it was written in Sanskrit. His first instinct wasn't to read or ask questions. It was to deflect. Is this about that asset freeze? He said, almost laughing, like it was a minor paperwork hiccup. No one laughed back. The chairman, Bernstein, a 70-year-old with skin like crumpled paper and a Rolodex that could make senators blink, just looked at him and said, "Your family holdings have been compromised, Travis. This isn't a compliance issue. This is a disclosure breach." Travis blinked. What holdings? That was his answer. And that was the moment it turned. Because they knew, every person in that room knew, that he didn't even know what he owned. His father had built the scaffolding of the Callaway empire across dozens of trusts and estate vehicles, layering ownership under layers of silent partnerships, foundations, and philanthropic shell orgs that funneled money through 6 countries before it landed back in the family name. The problem wasn't that Travis was hiding it. The problem was that he forgot it existed. And Contingency Delta didn't forgive forgetfulness. By 9:15, his father had called 3 times. The last one wasn't a call, it was a scream through a speakerphone that echoed off the walls. "You idiot. That clause is real. I told you not to fire her. I told you." The board sat in stunned silence. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. The collapse of those trusts didn't just expose $310 million in unprotected assets. It unraveled leverage. It pierced the veil on campaign contributions tied to offshore accounts. It put a family dynasty at legal risk in 3 jurisdictions. Callaway money was woven through political backchannels, shadow PACs, private equity plays, and now, thanks to one ignored clause, those threads were fraying fast. The family's estate lawyers were already on Zoom. Tired men in worse suits than they used to wear, scrambling to pick apart language they didn't write. They tried everything. Contesting the scope, challenging jurisdiction, arguing legislative conflict. But every route looped back to one truth. The contract was airtight. Worse than airtight, it was self-executing. No court order required. It had already triggered. And reversing it now would require a unanimous board vote and retroactive disclosure filings that would themselves be subject to regulatory audit. Which meant the only option was to stem the PR bleed and find someone to blame. And the one person who could explain it? I wasn't answering their calls. Travis sat pale, jaw clenched, fingers twitching as he scrolled through the PDF of the clause for the first time. The words probably meant nothing to him. But the total silence in that room, the eyes avoiding his, the chairman's subtle shake of the head, spoke volumes. He looked up and muttered, "Why would she do this?" No one answered. Because deep down they knew. I didn't do anything. They did. They handed power to a man who didn't understand consequence. And then they fired the only person who did. The leak wasn't loud. Just a 3-sentence blip in a dry internal newsletter passed around by a mid-level associate in finance. but it moved like fire through brush. Clause 2734 reportedly triggered rollback on multiple Callaway-tied trusts. Internal sources estimate exposure exceeding $310 million. No exclamation points. No drama. Just numbers. And in this world, numbers are war drums. By mid-morning, the rumor had metastasized. Compliance was locked down. Legal was under gag orders. The usual hallway gossip had been replaced by tight-lipped stares and inboxes flooded with CYA emails. You could feel the building holding its breath. It wasn't just a clause anymore. It was a question. Who the hell actually wrote this thing? At 1:12 p.m., I got the first ping from a journalist. Her name was Meryl, freelancer, sharp as a razor, working with a niche and a newsletter that specialized in tracking collapse points in major deals. She wasn't mainstream. She was worse, respected in the rooms that mattered. Her email was polite. Clinical. I'm reaching out regarding recent developments related to the contingency delta clause embedded in Section 2734 of the 5-Star Meridian Merger Agreement. Several sources have confirmed that its activation has impacted legacy Callaway interests. I'd like to confirm attribution. Were you its original architect? I didn't reply right away. I read it twice. Then 3 times. Then closed the tab and let the silence sit. 20 minutes later, I responded with a single line. I don't speak on active contracts. But I do believe in responsible authorship. She never wrote back. She didn't need to. That was the confirmation. And the fuse was now public. That same afternoon, the board did what they should have done weeks ago. They reopened the contract. All 2,900 pages. Not the summary deck. Not the executive brief. The real thing. The one I had written in the trenches. The one Travis had never touched except to mock its length and call it legacy bloat. They split into review teams. Legal, compliance, risk, finance. Red pens. Sticky tabs. Private Slack channels buzzing in deadpan bursts. And what they found? Clause after clause with precision teeth. Time triggers. Default traps. Disclosure mazes so elegantly constructed that even their most senior counsel had to diagram them on legal pads to comprehend. It was like realizing the pretty wallpaper in your penthouse was hiding a weapons vault. They found protections buried under what Travis called filler. They found fallback definitions that shielded us from hostile clawbacks and predatory reverse mergers. They found jurisdiction toggles in favor of states with airtight fiduciary standards. They found an entire substructure, built like a fail-safe bunker, not just to protect the company from outside threats, but from its own leadership. I hadn't just written a contract. I'd written a restraint system. And now, with Travis exposed, his reputation bleeding out, and the press beginning to stir, the board wasn't just angry. They were scared. Because the deeper they read, the more they realized. They'd handed the company keys to a man who didn't understand how the engine worked, and fired the mechanic. They weren't asking who wrote the contract anymore. They were asking who controlled the future of the company. And the answer was sitting quietly in a different state, watching the market ripple with the kind of storm only paperwork can summon. I didn't have to say a word. They were finally listening to what I'd already written. They say it happened just after 7 p.m., behind locked doors and shuttered blinds on the 46th floor. No streaming, no recording, no official minutes released. Just a long mahogany table surrounded by suits that had finally stopped pretending they were in control. The chairman, Bernstein, was the one who read it aloud. His voice cracked once. Just once. Should leadership cause material breach through ignorance or omission, they forfeit indemnity. That was it. One sentence. One clause. The final line of Section Delta. And with that, the room shifted. No shouting. No drama. Just a hush so thick you could hear the air conditioner hum. Travis didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. Every angle had been exhausted, every appeal denied, every loophole sewn shut with language so tight it may as well have been concrete. He just sat there. Deflated. Face drawn. Collar loose. The man who fired me because I was too slow for the new era now looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. They removed him quietly. No statement. No tribute post on LinkedIn. Not even a farewell email drafted by PR. Just a memo circulated the next morning. Effective immediately, Travis Calloway will be transitioning out of his role as CEO. That was the entire obituary. Within an hour, I got the call. Bernstein, direct line. We'd like to retain you.
Contractuelle consultation.
To help interpret the rest. The rest. Because now they were afraid of what they hadn't seen. Because now the contract wasn't just paper, it was prophecy. I paused. Thought about the satisfaction of watching them squirm through every clause. Every word I wrote when no one cared what I was doing. Thought about how it felt when Travis publicly dismissed 11 years of meticulous, surgical work with a single smirk. Thought about the lilies. No, I said. I won't be consulting. A long silence. Then a simple reply. Understood. I hung up and walked to the window. Sunset had just begun cutting through the clouds, spilling gold across the tops of buildings. I watched the city flicker beneath me. Somewhere in that skyline was a company still untangling the legal architecture I left behind. My name might never be spoken in their earnings calls or press briefings, but it would live in every decision they made from now on. I didn't need revenge. I had the final word. I already wrote the ending. You're just now reading it.